the U.S. Forest Service and Intertribal Timber Council, 638 Authority webinar. My name is Chaz O'Brien. I'll be facilitating the call today. I also have Tisha Street with me, who's providing us some technical support behind on the line. I'm going to begin by covering just a bit of the logistics and run through the agenda before we get started to make sure everyone's accommodated properly, and then we'll move into the process of today's engagement. So to get started, what I'd like to do is everyone would have received a copy of the agenda in your invite. We also have it in the downloadable files section over to the right. If you do have any difficulties operating any of that, please leave a note in the chat box, and Tisha will track that for you to help us get you those documents as if needed. So there's a few options. They'll be displayed on the screen. They'll be in the invite as an attachment for you to download, or you can grab them from within the Adobe Connect pod here today. So what I'm going to do is review our agenda for today. We'll have that posted up in just a moment here. Tisha, can you pull that one up for me for just a moment, please? What I'd like to do first is just cover a bit of our operating norms for today. Those were on the third page of the agenda that was sent out to everyone. I'm not going to read along with them, but just to kind of paraphrase that in order to support the conversation that we're having today and the information sharing being balanced across to everyone, just the basic principles of kindness and collaboration around treating each other with respect. Everyone's ideas and points have value. Electronic courtesy, if you could turn off or mute your phones and ensure that you have we'll have you muted, and you'll need to *6 to unmute yourself. We'll remind you of that along the way. We want you to be comfortable, and we are going to work to honor time today since we just have 2 hours together. I'm going to ask that we all agree to act in good faith, to communicate our interests as we're moving along today, and agree to address the issues and concerns of other participants, and that we can make commitments that we can keep moving ahead on this in terms of our conversations. So for today's agenda, Tisha, can you pull up the agenda for me, please? Let's see, while Tisha's pulling that up, I'll walk through it. First, we're going to start with the orientation and logistics. We're going to have an opening and a welcome. We're going to do a few segments on background today. So we'll have 3 sessions, 3 15-minute informative sessions on background. I'll go through the process for each section as we get started. We will be asking folks to gather your questions as these presentations are offered into the chat box. So any questions you have while the presenters are presenting, you can go ahead and put those in the chat box. You can also open up, take a look at the PowerPoint there for yourself if you need to take a look at that to track along if you want to go a little deeper on the questions as we move along. From there, we'll move into that question and answer section. We'll do a pilot case study with the Tulalip Tribe and the Forest Service pilot project for 638. We'll move into the agreement template. Reverse order there. We'll do the 638 authority template, then we'll move into the case study, and then we'll move into a session where we can have a little bit of polling and get some idea sharing into the room before we close today. If you have any special needs or accommodations that we should be aware of, or if anything comes up again, just please use the chat box for that as we get started on the call today. One thing that Lynn will be highlighting for us is that this is the beginning of a multi-step process. There is another engagement planned after this, and so there will be a series of information rollouts on this that will be discussed throughout the call today. Again, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat box, and we'll do our best to get to those in as soon as we can. Lynn, I'm going to pass this over to you then to just do a quick highlight. If folks could see on the first page of the agenda that we sent out, there was a little bit of an overview of the vision, the objectives, and the measures of success for today's call. And do you mind just highlighting the vision and the purpose and then moving us down to our measures of success so we're all on the same page as we get started?
I sure can. Thanks, Chaz. And as Chaz reminded us, this is our first stab at this, and so we hope we've pulled together the information to get us to where we need to be. So our objectives is really we want to share where we're at with implementing the 638 agreements and what we think our next steps are for successful implementation. We want to share the first pilot project that we're just about ready to implement. We want to provide enough information so that Forest Service folks and our tribal partners can start the conversations about TFPA and 638 agreements to develop additional pilot projects. And then we'll take the questions that we receive today and use those to build our best practices guide. So how do we know if we're successful? Really, we want folks to leave today with enough understanding of 638 to initiate the conversations like I mentioned. We want our tribal partners to understand how the Forest Service implementation of 638 is different from DOI. And we want everybody to understand what the next steps are in the authorities, the pilot projects, and how to access information. And back to you, Chaz.
Thanks, Lynn. So before we begin getting started, what I'd like to have folks do is a check-in activity before we begin. I'd like you to put your name, the location where you're based, and the number one reason why you were interested in joining today's engagement as your check-in today in the chat box. Your name, your location, your role title, in terms of your association with this effort, and the number one thing that was important to you. And with that, I'm going to move to Dave Wilson to begin introducing our welcoming speakers. You'll need to *6 to unmute, Dave. Looks like we might be having a little bit of a technical difficulty there. So what I'm going to do is Dave Wilson is on the acting assistant director position and managing forest products modernization right now. I'm going to go right ahead and pass it over to Lynn to introduce our opening welcome speakers.
Sure, thank you. I'd like to introduce Alan Rowley, who is the Associate Deputy Chief for the National Forest System with the Forest Service. Alan, I'll turn it to you, please.
Well, thanks for the introduction. I want to start by thanking all of you for taking time out of your busy day and to join us this afternoon. And a special thanks to the Intertribal Timber Council, who's helped us with today's webinar and with all the thinking and planning that we've invested in this. We couldn't have done it without them. The agency stance today, the place we would start from is this is about learning. So Lynn talked about the objectives and what success looks like. I'll add a little bit more. So we learn today, we get exposed today, and we try this. We try this in a couple places, and we learn from those trials of how to get it better and better and better. And so we don't have everything nailed down on exactly how this should work. We hope through experience we'll learn and get better. And then I'll turn to, so why are we having this, this conversation at all? Well, one, Congress gave us the authority to use the 638 agreement, and it seems like a good tool. It actually seems like a great tool. Think of it this way. My experience has been when I work with people who care about the resource, who care about the problem, who care about the issue, care about the work, we get stuff done. We get stuff done even if there are roadblocks, because people care and they're motivated. I would much rather work with a team of people who care, who may not have everything perfect, than a team of experts that aren't really care about the results. I think a Tribal Forest Protection Act proposal is the definition of a proposal from people who care. I want them on my team. Whatever team I'm on, a tribe, a pueblo, a sovereign nation that makes a proposal and says, hey, we've got this idea for some land management activities. I want that resource. I want to be on the team with them because they care about the resources, they care about the issues, they care about the problems, and I can only see great things from coming from that. So I'd look at success today. Lynn gave you some, and let me expand on those a little bit. One, Lynn talked about understanding the templates and the forms and the process. You know, I'd put that in the category of getting smarter about the process and where to start. So that's success for today. Another element of success for today is you leave knowing you can do this. You have the authority, you have the skills, you know as much as anybody else, and you leave here going, yep, I can make this happen. That's exactly what I'm looking for. And the last part of success for today, I hope, is you leave inspired to act, and you can imagine the possibilities. What are the options, and where can I use 638 agreements? Where can I participate in a team of people who care about getting something done? So I hope you find that inspiring and can imagine and start to think about all the different places where this is a great tool to use. That's all I wanted to do in terms of introducing the webinar. And again, thank you for time out of your busy day. Thank you for the Intertribal Timber Council helping us. And I really hope you think about this in terms of building that team of people that, yeah, we got a plan. We care, we got a plan, and we're going to figure it out. That's it for my remarks. Thank you. Back to you, Chaz.
Chaz, you're on mute.
Go ahead and for your welcome, Cody. Star 6 to unmute, Cody.
How about now?
Perfect.
Can you
Great.
hear me now, Chaz?
You're good.
Okay. So I just want to thank everybody for participating today. Welcome everybody. The tribes in general have been very excited about the new authorities that were granted in the 2018 Farm Bill. We tried for many, many years to find a mechanism that helped us engage in shared stewardship or anchor forests or all hands, all lands, whatever concept was the buzzword at the time that helped us engage across all ownerships for the benefit of ecosystem health and resilience. So I think this is a tool that definitely has some potential. We need to figure out how we can navigate that process, look at how 638 contracting works as tribes know it under the Bureau of Indian Affairs versus how it will work under the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Forest Service. But again, many opportunities to share those tribal perspectives, to share those management goals across the landscape for the benefit of not only the tribes, but all the people of the region. And this is something that is especially helpful for tribes because many of them have reserved treaty rights, reserved hunting, fishing, gathering rights on lands that are adjacent to their reservations. So they have a lot of investment in how that land is managed. It has very close ties to their culture and who they are as people. So this gives us the opportunity to be an active manager and make sure that we have the opportunity or to have some direction, some guidance given to the Forest Service on what tribal perspectives are and what we think is appropriate in the management of those lands. So I know we've got a lot of information to cover, so I'll keep this brief. But again, thank you everybody for participating, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Cody. And so now we're going to move into the presentation section of today's engagement. And so again, in terms of process, the purpose of this is to understand the conditions shaping the current conditions and to share information with you to engage in this process. There's going to be 3 presentations. There's going to be a question and answer after, and the chat box is where you'll add your questions throughout. Stephanie and Lynn are on the line with us. Lynn Schulte and Stephanie Lucero are going to support us with grabbing those, keeping an eye on those questions. Those questions that are not answered today that we can't get to, we're going to be pulling out, and they'll be answered after the engagement, and Lynn will speak to that about how that comes as part of the post-meeting packages. There is, again, a PowerPoint that's attached to both the invite, and there's a PDF there, the Tribal 638 webinar presentation and downloadable files, so that if you need to go back to anything and formulate a question while the presentations are occurring, we can go from there on that and collect those. Again, if you need any help, please use the chat box, and Tisha will be sweeping that as well for any technical support. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Alicia to get us started.
Chaz, this is Estelle Bowman. I wanted to let you know that Undersecretary Jim Hubbard is ready to give his remarks.
Okay, great, thanks. Let's turn it over to the Undersecretary. Thank you. And it's *6 to unmute. It would be *6 to unmute. Let's see if we're getting Mr. Hubbard's voice into the room.
Okay, Chaz, there was just a note that from Debbie Pressman said that he had to leave the call. So let's go ahead and continue and turn it over to Alicia.
*6 to unmute, Alicia. Try *6 again. You're good. Thanks. Go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Good afternoon. I'm Alicia Belshiter. I'm an analyst here in the Washington Office of Tribal Relations with the Forest Service. And I want to welcome you all. I think this is going to be a really helpful discussion as we move forward to flesh out our implementation of the 638 Authority. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the Forest Service trust responsibility and our consultation process going forward. So initially, in terms of fulfilling our government trust responsibility, the agency works to ensure that our actions never diminish the rights of tribes and tribal members. Treating the National Forest Service managed lands as resources in trust for the tribes, be they sacred sites or springs or those reserve rights that Cody mentioned. We observe and enforce all laws that have been enacted for the protection of tribal cultural interests. We ensure that all Forest Service program benefits reach tribes and tribal communities. And we observe the principles of consultation whenever our policies and decisions have the potential to impact those tribal interests and communities. What about government-to-government consultation regarding this particular effort? As most of you may know, we have one of the most robust tribal consultation policies in the federal family with our 120-day mandatory for national policy. What we've done this year is start far in advance of crafting that policy and focusing on partnerships with tribes and the Intertribal Timber Council as subject matter experts on natural resource management utilizing 638 authority. This partnership has been used as a proof of concept to tailor a Forest Service strategy for 638 implementation that incorporates the learning that we've achieved to date and going forward with those pilot projects, as Alan mentioned, in learning every time to make it better and better as we go along. At the juncture where the agency will put pen to paper to actually create directives in our handbook and manuals for 638, the formal 120-day government-to-government consultation will be initiated for our own consultation policy. But notwithstanding that formal government-to-government consultation, tribes are welcome to provide input into this process at any time. And with that, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Jim Durglow. Jim is a member of the Confederated Salish, Pandore, and Kootenai tribes of northwestern Montana. He is currently the Wildland Fire Technical Specialist and former Operations Committee Chairman for the Intertribal Timber Council, and he comes to us with a wealth of experience, decades, in wildland fire management, forest planning and management, and environmental compliance. And Jim is going to let us know a little bit about the history of the TFPA program and how all of this collectively fits together with our new 638 authority. Thank you.
Go ahead, Jim. And star 6 to unmute.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for taking some time out of your busy days in this uncertain time of a national or global pandemic. I have the great opportunity to provide some context history of the Forest Protection Act. In the summer of 2003, 18 Indian reservations were invaded by wildfire from adjacent federal lands. 11 of the fires occurred in Southern California, burning over 30,000 acres, killing 10 people, and consuming 130 homes. 2 reservations were burned entirely to the ground. Unfortunately, this was not a first-time occurrence for the tribes. In the past, several tribes have lost valuable resources to wildfire that started on neighboring federal land. The Tribal Forest Protection Act, PL, or Public Law 108-278 of 2004, was passed in the aftermath of these catastrophic events in order to promote a means for tribes to propose projects that would protect their rights, their land, and the resources, reducing threats from wildfire, insects, and disease. These threats are more prevalent today, probably more so than ever, with larger, more destructive wildfires occurring in the West every year. If you could just keep it there. Tribes and the U.S. Forest Service share nearly 3,000 miles of borderlands and hundreds of thousands of acres of watersheds, and millions of acres of usual and accustomed places in which the tribes maintain use and deep cultural ties. National forests are vitally important to fulfill fiduciary trust responsibilities for tribal communities, lands, and resources held in trust for federally recognized tribes and their members, including, but not limited to, treaty and other reserved rights and protection of cultural resources, as was mentioned earlier. And just to note, there are additional requirements for the TFPA proposal that are spelled out in the law, and there's an attachment that has been provided as part of this webinar series. Again, TFPA is PL 108-278. Next slide. Some of the Tribal Forest Protection Act basics, I think that, certainly a dialogue and conversation needs to occur well before a TFPA proposed project is submitted. Successful TFPA projects rely on good working relationships. A clear understanding of federal contracts and acquisition systems takes time, and that also needs to be a consideration. Proposals are prepared and sent to the Forest Service regional foresters for review and or approval. But just to note, they should be developed at the local level. Next. There are many ways, many contracting mechanisms to choose from to implement the TFPA projects. Each of these has its benefits and challenges. The key here is that we need to find the best tool for the job. And again, there's an attachment that shows the various agreements in more detail. They're on your screen. Next, we're going to go into, shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about PL 93-638. PL-638 or PL 93-638 is primarily used by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Health and Human Services to transfer management of programs and services to tribes, such as education and health services, forest management, law enforcement, and other natural resource programs. The late President Richard Nixon told Congress at the time that the federal government should begin to recognize and build upon the capacities and insights of the Indian people. PL 93-638 authorized the Secretary of Interior and the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, not USDA until recently, to enter into contracts with and make grants directly to federally recognized Indian tribes. This legislation made tribal self-determination a focus of the federal government and reversed a 30-year effort under its preceding termination policy. So this particular legislation is very significant to Indian tribes to reach their self-determination goals. Next. And now the 2018 Farm Bill. Section 8703 of the 2018 Farm Bill is titled Tribal Forest Management Demo Project and authorizes the USDA Forest Service and DOI to enter into 638 contracts on a demonstration basis, whereby the tribes or tribal organization may perform the administrative and management functions of programs implementing the TFPA. The ITC worked hard to insert the language with purposeful intent to increase the use of TFPA and increase the cross-boundary collaboration efforts. Next.
Thanks, Jim. I'll jump in here. This is Lynn Schulte, and I'm a grants and agreement specialist for state and private forestry, but right now I'm detailed to forest management to help implement and get going these 638 agreements. So look, we're going to shift just a little bit from the background and talk about where we're at and what we've got going on now. So how we intend to start implementing is with project-specific 638 agreements, and then we'll explore the programmatic applications as we learn more about the authority. But the important part is that we really need to take a close look with how we incorporate the tribal interests and priorities with our planning and budgeting. I want to make a couple of points here. One is that you'll notice that, and it's probably more noticeable to our tribal partners, we're referring to these as 638 agreements. The law says we can use contracts, grants, or agreements. And in the Forest Service, we've elected to use agreements because we felt that when we say contract, it makes people think about a procurement action where we're procuring something for the benefit of the Forest Service, and that's not the case here. I also want to point out that 638 agreements with the Forest Service are potentially open to any of the 574 federally recognized tribes and also tribal organizations that are defined in 25 U.S.C. 5304. So we can start out with pilot projects. You've heard that mentioned. We can do 10 of them before we get formal approval from OMB for one of our new forms, and we'll take a peek at that a little bit further in the presentation. So what we want to look at for these pilot projects is where we have shelf-ready projects and funding. Do we have an approved TFPA proposal, because that's required in the law, in the Farm Bill? Do we have the NEPA done? We want to look at a broad geographic range for our pilot projects and a variety of tribes, both in size and capacity and types of projects. So we'll use these pilot projects as a learning lab. And from that, and actually we've started already drafting a best practices guide to provide us with some guidance while we're learning before we are able to put together formal policy. So here's the big question. This is what everybody wants to know, right? Where's the money coming from? Unfortunately, 638 authority through the Farm Bill did not come with any extra funding for the Forest Service. The expectation is that we would use our standard appropriated funding, which is why it's so important that we discuss projects and plan ahead in out years with our tribal partners to be able to incorporate those priorities. We have the option of using some of our permanent funds like salvage sale funding and timber trust funds like brush disposal money. We can use third-party money, say if we have grant money from another entity or potentially RTRL money. Unfortunately, we cannot use shared stewardship retained receipts for 638. We ran that past our Office of General Counsel and got a no on that one. So let's take a minute and talk about the agreement itself. That's always the question. What's it going to look like? You know, because it's kind of a new shiny thing. So we'll have objectives and standards spelled out in a scope of work, just like we're used to looking at. We'll have budgets and financial plans, displaying the cost by category. Performance is the responsibility of our tribal cooperator, but the Forest Service will provide technical assistance whenever it's requested, and of course our tribal cooperators can give preference to tribal subcontractors. So the agreement itself is comprised of a number of different elements. We have the agreement cover sheet, and that's the form that's going to OMB for approval right now. We have the 638 provisions or template, and that's one of the documents that's available for you to download. We'll have the scope of work and a financial plan describing the work and the funding. We'll have the TFPA proposal and the approval letter because that's the element described in the Farm Bill that's required. As applicable, we'll include the tribal resolution to enter into the 638 agreement, and then any other documents that we might need for clarification like maps or silvicultural prescriptions. Very similar to what we would do with any other agreement. So now let's get into some more details here. The 638 agreement cover sheet is a brand new form, and we've submitted it to OMB for approval, and we can use it up to 10 times before we receive that approval. And it's due to the Paperwork Reduction Act, and that's as deep into those details as I'm going to go. But what's on the cover sheet, the agreement number, the authority, who the parties are, how much money, reporting information, and signatures. And it's just a one-page document, so it's very clear, everything in one place. Attached to that are the 638 template provisions. And these standard provisions that you can take a look at in the download are a locked document that will be attached to each 638 pilot agreement. It's very similar to the model agreement that's used by DOI, but we made some adjustments to accommodate how the Forest Service is going to implement. Now, we didn't do that all by ourselves. The Forest Service didn't. We worked together with tribal partners across the country to develop these provisions, and then we had it reviewed by our Office of General Counsel. Before we make it locked and standard for all of the agreements, there will be time for comment and review and through the consultation process. So let's look at some of the highlights. We need to remember, because of TFPA, that this is a tribal project. This is not a Forest Service project that a tribal cooperator performs for the Forest Service. We don't have to require the mutual benefit and interest like we do with our other partnership agreements, but as Cody and Jim have mentioned, you know, these projects are for the benefit of the land and the benefit of everybody. No matches required. And the grant regulations at 2 CFR 200 don't apply either. The agreement can include technical assistance and capacity building. Indirect costs and contract support costs are allowed. And as requested, the Forest Service may provide equipment, vehicles, and personal property necessary for completion of the project. And through this agreement, we can also provide access to excess property by the tribal cooperator. Now, I mentioned earlier that we were developing a best practices guide, and it is a working draft. It will include some annotation about the template, some overall perspective about the 638 agreements, and then it will include a very robust FAQ section, including the questions that we get from this webinar. So I really appreciate people asking their questions, because we can't sit and think about what everybody's questions might be. So once we get this good draft done, it'll be located on a Forest Service public-facing website under the Forest Management webpage, and we'll also have it linked to the Intertribal Timber Council webpage, and that'll be forthcoming. And this will be a living document and frequently updated as we learn from pilot projects. We decided early on and took some lessons from our implementation of Good Neighbor. We didn't want to make policy or regulation without trying and seeing how this was actually going to work, and giving ourselves the space to adjust and learn. So this is the route that we're taking, is through this best practices guide that will eventually inform our policy and regulations. So I'm going to stop talking right here and we'll take some time with Stephanie and take a look at some of the questions that are in the chat box and see if we can get some of those answered. So Stephanie,
Thanks, Lynn.
I'll let you catch the first few here.
So Stephanie, I think you've been collecting and you have a few in the chat box. I think some of them you might want to pass over to Lynn. I'm going to stand my camera down and let the two of you kind of come into center stage here while we answer these. So I'll pass it to you, Stephanie, and you can choose whether you'd like to answer those or pass them to Lynn or others. And again, for other folks, we're going to continue through then. If we move through the questions now, we'll do the case study and move into the second portion of the dialogue session, and we'll again sweep questions there. So you can continue to chat your questions into the chat box there, and we'll go ahead, Stephanie. Thanks.
Thanks. So Lynn, we had a couple questions regarding whether or not tribes need to be under 638 authority under Department of Interior as agreement, or does that matter for tribes to utilize the 638 authority under the USDA Forest Services opportunity?
No,
so that's the patient. Yep.
Thanks, Stephanie. Good question, and no, that's not necessary. We did have a question that came in quite a while ago and wondered if they had to be a compacted tribe, and the answer is no. The key for us, though, is you've got to have that TFPA proposal.
And a related question to the TFPA proposal, someone wanted clarification on whether or not you needed to submit a TFPA proposal and a 638 proposal for the demo project, or if those two proposals could be combined.
Two separate things. So that we need to have the TFPA proposal and have that approved. And again, Jim did a great job describing that process. But then remember, there was that other slide that showed all the different types of instruments that we have that we might use to take care of to implement, that's the word I wanted, to implement a TFPA project. It might be a stewardship contract, or it might be a participating agreement. We'll just pick the best tool for the job. Because remember, right now we're starting implementation with projects rather than programs.
All right, and just to reiterate, the 638 under Department of Interior is going to be a separate authority and kind of management than the 638 under USDA Forest Service.
That's right.
We had a couple questions regarding NEPA. There was one question I can answer. Someone was wondering if California Environmental Quality Act fell under this. That's separate since it's a state regulation. But there was a number of questions regarding who is responsible for conducting NEPA evaluation and who pays for NEPA. And I know you mentioned under this that the demo projects do need to have NEPA ready, but I think this relates to a question after the demo project process is over.
You know, that's a big question no matter what authority that we're talking about. Is NEPA is the responsibility of the Forest Service, and it's very clear about that in the Farm Bill. That doesn't mean that we can't have our tribal cooperators working with us side by side. The ultimate responsibility, the signature on the NEPA document, is with the Forest Service.
Okay. And then we have some questions about the funding for the 638 agreements. There was questions about whether returned receipts in a stewardship agreement with a tribe could be used in this 638, and we had some discussion on that, as well as just generally where the funding might come for some of these 638 projects.
Right. That question about stewardship retained receipts always comes up, and the answer is that stewardship retained receipts can only be used on a stewardship agreement or contract. We tried really hard.
And then related to that is whether or not Forest Service has a projected amount available for these projects for the 638 opportunities.
We do not. We do not. We didn't get any special funding or have anything set aside.
Okay. One question I know you've received before is the question of indirect costs. Are tribes allowed to include indirect costs, or who's responsible for those?
Absolutely. Indirect costs should be included in the 638 agreement.
And then I've got at least 2 or 3 more questions. Chaz, I'll look to you to stop me, but I'm just going to keep running through them. Alaska corporations, are they included or excluded? Are they considered tribal organizations?
Alicia, are you on? Could you take this one?
Remember to star 6, Alicia.
Star 6 one more time, Alicia, to see if that brings you in. Stephanie, do we have someone else that we can move the question to while we get Alicia's voice in the room? Or can we go to another question while we move her in?
Let's flag another question, and then we can jump to the Alaska corporations when Alicia comes on. We might want to answer, we have a number of questions on the indirect that are very specific. We may need to push those to the frequently asked, as well as some of the funding and how to do that with negotiated rates. So I'll see if we have those. There's a couple other that I wanted to make sure we covered. And those relate to clarification on how a tribe can apply for a TFPA demo project and or a 638 proposal under the demo projects.
So remember, it's a two-part process, right? So the first thing is to start the conversation about with the TFPA project. You know, identify the TFPA project, working with the Forest Service, and get the funding together, and if it fits, then we can certainly evaluate it as a pilot project. The Washington Office Forest Management Group is taking the lead on that, making sure that, you know, we don't do all 10 projects in the state of Washington in Region 6. You know, that we want to get a real diversity of projects because, again, we're learning from these. So first off, TFPA proposal, and then we need to look at what's the best tool for the job. And if it's a 638 agreement, then we can certainly consider that for a pilot project.
And then we have some adjacency questions in terms of guidelines. If we can't get to those, I can respond to some of those in the chat box. Basically, what are the guidelines and how adjacency is defined. And my understanding is there's no distinct guidelines in terms of adjacency, but it really depends on the risk to the tribe that is being addressed in the proposal. And so there's no strict and fast rules in terms of what qualifies as adjacent, but feel free to add anything to that, Lynn, or any of our other presenters.
Right. Stephanie, I think we have Alicia back in the room. Alicia, we have you online?
Can you hear me?
You can go ahead.
That's going to go on my epitaph. She didn't hit *6 enough times. To the question of Alaska corporations, those are included within the definition of Indian tribe as well as they are defined by ANCSA. So they are qualifying entities as Indian tribes under our 638 authority.
And I'll go back to Stephanie. We have time for more questions. We've got a good bit of time left, so keep going with those. Seeing some more in the chat box.
Okay, great. Yeah, we have a lot. I don't know if we'll be able to get through all of them, but we've got a good chunk of them, so thanks, folks. We have some other questions regarding the tribal projects versus not a Forest Service project. That was some language that was pulled from the slide. Can you explain, the specificity of these being tribal projects, tribal interests versus a Forest Service project? Lynn, you're muted, so you'll need to press star 6. There you go. Now you're good.
No, it's just my phone muted. For our Forest Service folks, this is going to be a little bit different way of thinking about things. Often when we work with partners, including tribes, it's because we have a project or we have a mutual project that we'd like to work on together, and so we're used to identifying that mutual interest and benefit, and it's a project that's on our to-do list, on the Forest Service's to-do list. This is very different in that through the TFPA process, our tribal partner has identified a project that is critical to them, whether it's hazardous fuel reduction or insect and disease that's affecting their lands, and they've elevated it as a project that needs to be taken care of. And so it's just a little bit different perspective on how we look at the project.
Thanks, Lynn. And then we had some discussions related to that in the chat box as well. Can you clarify where this work can be done? Would it be work done on Forest Service lands adjacent to tribal lands? Could it be done on tribal lands, Aboriginal territories? We've had a whole gambit of questions related to where the work can happen under the 638 authority and under these agreements.
And Lynn, I believe, Lynn, I believe Cody had a couple things to add on the adjacency question also. Thanks.
Excellent. I'll leave this one to Cody. He's much better suited to answer.
All right, thanks, Lynn. So if you look at the Act, it didn't really define adjacency, and I think that was intentional. It defined conditions. So if there's a forest health issue, if there's a potential fire issue, if there's just in general some concerns that tribes have about resource management, those things qualify as adjacency. So I think that decision is really deferred to either the forest or the region. And our experience so far is that they've not been very restrictive about what that means. So adjacency doesn't necessarily mean sharing a common border, but you're in close enough proximity that whether that be an insect outbreak or a fire, those have some potential to impact the tribes.
And Cody, there was some clarifications requested about risk to tribes in determining adjacency, and I think you covered some of it. And there's also some discussions about cultural adjacency. I think it's kind of defining what some of those risks or impacts may be to tribes that would qualify under TFPA for adjacency. Can you elaborate that more?
So again, I think they're deferring those decisions to the forests, the tribes, and the regions to look at what the issue is, what the intent of the proposal is, and determine whether those are actually adjacent or not. And again, in our experience with the ITC, those have been interpreted pretty loosely. If there's a desire to address a management issue from a tribal perspective, the forests have been pretty open to working with them.
Great. And then we do have some specific questions regarding project size. We might need to defer those. I did want to there was some questions regarding the 10, and this is probably best for Lynn, the 10 pilot project cap, why that exists, and kind of what happens next for Forest Service implementing the 638 authority.
Sure, I'm happy to address that one. It's the same thing we ran into with our good neighbor agreements, as a matter of fact. When the federal government has a new form that will be requesting information from the public, we have to go through a clearance through the Paperwork Reduction Act because we can't be overly burdensome on the public. And so because on this form there's information that someone that's not from the federal government has to provide, we have to go through and say how many hours it's going to take to complete the form, etc. So we have the ability to use our draft form up to 10 times before we have that OMB approval. And so that's where that limit of 10 pilot projects comes from. Once we have the OMB approval, then we don't have that limitation anymore, and hopefully we'll have some pretty good guidelines in place and be able to really move forward with some projects.
And just to clarify, there were some questions about how those projects were selected. I think you alluded a little bit that the projects will be selected based on NEPA readiness, whether there's a TFPA proposal, looking at geographic difference nationally to get a good kind of cross-section of different types of projects. Are there other criteria that will help folks understand how those 10 projects are selected?
No, there really aren't. You hit them exactly right, Stephanie. At this point in time, we have one pilot project that we're just about ready to sign the agreement on, and you're going to hear about that in just a little bit here. We've got some others that are waiting in the wings where we're just waiting on funding. So there's still space for some more projects.
Great.
So with that, I'm going to step in for just a moment here, Lynn and Stephanie. I think we're at a nice point with that kind of framing of what's going to be coming next and folks getting that bigger picture. To just pause for a minute, I'm going to have Stephanie continue. Please continue adding your questions to the chat. For the sake of the flow of the meeting, I'm going to have us move on to the case studies, and then we're going to move into the polling and engagement section, and we'll come back to those questions. So I'll give Stephanie a moment to go through them and sort through it a little bit more finely as we move through this. So I'm going to ask for us to move to the 638 pilot project case study with our friends on the Tulalip Tribe pilot project.
I'm going to take just a moment and introduce Dan Kippervasser and Libby Nelson. Dan is the Shared Stewardship Coordinator for the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest in the state of Washington in Region 6. And Libby is the Senior Environmental Policy Analyst in the Treaty Rights Office in the Natural Resource Department of the Tulalip Tribe in the state of Washington. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Lynn. And thanks for the opportunity to say a few words about Tulalip's 638 demonstration project. It's the Tulalip Beaver project. It also happens to be our first project under the TFPA, which I think was really a lucky coincidence that we became the first demonstration project due to timing of it having been just accepted in March. And I think Dan's presence on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie, he saw this opportunity and put it out there for us. So I just want to say Tulalip is a federally recognized sovereign Indian government and a successor in interest to the Skykomish, the Snoqualmie, and the Snohomish Indians and other allied bands signatory to the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. In that treaty, the tribes reserved rights to hunt, fish, gather on the area that's encompassed now by the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, and including the project area for the beaver work. I also wanted to note that Molly Alves, who is our beaver expert and wildlife biologist at Tulalip, was unable to join the call, and so I'll do my best to represent the project. And my role as the administrator of our MOA with the Forest Service has really been to kind of grease the skids, facilitate getting a TFPA project, and then helping with the development of the 638 template. I just want to acknowledge the other people who have, this has been a team effort, both internally at Tulalip and with the Forest Service, who we've asked to collaborate with us in our desire to develop a TFPA project. And That includes our Jason Gobin, our fisheries director, as well as our forestry staff, Nick Johnson, Russell Moses, and Ross Fenton, as well as Andrew Gobin in our Treaty Rights Office, who helped draft the TFPA proposal. And then also we've had our self-governance and grant staff help a lot with the development of the 638 template, and we've had our budget administrator too. So it's hopefully we've been able to frame a decent starting point with this template. And I will be presenting with Dan, and Dan's been, I haven't actually met him in person, only virtually, so it's good to meet you, Dan.
So for Dan and Libby, just let me know when I should advance your slides for you. Thanks.
Okay, you go ahead now. And Dan?
Sure. Just to set the brief context on this, beavers were prevalent throughout the area and played a really key ecological role. However, during a period of time where trapping was increasing, commercial trapping was increasing, and we had changes in development in the area, the population really declined. And it wasn't until actually fairly recently that there was another alternative for how to handle beavers that are in conflict with other uses. And up until recently, it was basically that they would be removed and killed. And so this came along as an opportunity to explore other ways. And what we know about the beavers in these streams is that they played a key ecological role that really was important to maintaining the system health. Their dams filter sediment and moderate water temperature. It slows bank erosion. And especially key for this area, those dams and the water that they back up provide a refuge for juvenile salmon, which is a treaty resource. And so that's where the interest of our tribal partners comes in here, and where this proposal kind of came from. So I think with that, I'll give it right back to you for our timeline.
Okay. So I wanted to say that we developed and signed an MOA with the Forest Service back in 2007, and that really marked a significant change in our relationship with the Forest Service and led to the development of a work plan to implement that MOA and many collaborative projects, including one fairly unique co-management project to bring back huckleberry and other resources of importance to the tribe. This particular project arose after a number of staff at Tulalip attended a TFPA workshop in 2017 that ITC and Forest Service hosted, and I think Stephanie was our facilitator, and had broadened our understanding of the TFPA, and after that we got to work at Tulalip in wanting to develop a pilot project under the TFPA authority. And so we asked the Forest Service to join us in those discussions as we both kind of explored an authority that neither us or the Forest Service staff at NBS knew a lot about. It took us a couple of years, but we finally submitted a proposal in 2019, and it was accepted by the Regional Forest in 2020. Next slide. So our proposal was a fairly modest one. Under the TFPA, tribes would reintroduce beaver into the South Fork of the Stillaguamish River, which represented an expansion of existing work the tribes are doing in the Snohomish watershed just south of the Stilly watershed. The project, as Dan said, taps into the unique ecosystem engineering capabilities of beaver to restore natural processes in the river. I mean, we believe at Tulalip that beavers with greater presence in the upper portions of the watershed will help offset some of the water losses and water quality issues that we have ongoing, and are really contributing to the threatened status of Chinook salmon, steelhead, and bull trout, which are a critical tribal resource and treaty right. So I think that's all I need to say about that one. Let's go to the next one. the wildlife biologists have developed what they're calling the beaver intrinsic potential model, which they've applied in the Snohomish system and now are applying in the Stillaguamish, South Fork of the Stillaguamish River. And I don't know if we mentioned, these are in western Washington, Region 6, north of the Seattle area. And they have applied this model to the river to find out those areas that are most suitable for beaver reintroduction, will get the greatest impact. And then they will further look at some of these sites to refine what's practical for reaching, accessible, and we'll choose up to about 30 sites based on this modeling effort, working in collaboration with the Forest Service. Okay, next one. As I said, the proposal is pretty modest, but we think it's precedent-setting in that it's our first TFPA project and in support of off-reservation treaty rights. We'll support 2 seasonal employees and supplies for a 3-year period, and there'll be up to 30 relocations over those 3 seasons. Next slide. So the proposal includes Tulip staff reviewing the sites using that beaver intrinsic model. They trap what, quote, so-called nuisance beavers in the lowlands that are in conflict with landowners because of their damming activity, and move them as family units into these new locations, and then continue to watch them and their success over time. Okay, next slide. Dan, I'll let you cover this.
Yeah, and so this brings us to where we got together, and all the work that was done in advance with the 638 contracting law, and then our authority for the pilot in 2018. This came together at just the perfect time when the TFPA proposal had gone through a lot of collaboration and development, and then finally was approved at the region. And so we came to our workshop, and so I'm very grateful to the tribe for participating and bringing folks on during this really difficult time where a lot of folks were also furloughed from the tribe, and coming in to help develop this agreement template and provide a lot of feedback on what would work and what wouldn't work. And I think one of the things that was great about that process was we got to dive into those provisions that were shared and have discussions about what those provisions could mean for us as partners and the things that it could put on the table. And for my part, I think one of the pieces that I find most interesting and exciting, and it's kind of the sleeping lion in this document, is provision 211, which provides an opportunity that I think the agency really needs to explore for innovation and for the inclusion of traditional knowledge. And basically that provision says that that federal program guidelines, manual, and policy do not necessarily apply, which could be a really scary thing for a lot of folks. And of course, as an agreement under 638, we can agree on the sideboard that we want to place on any activity, but what it also does is it creates an opportunity for real innovation and for exploring different ways of doing work. And I think that is one of the greatest possible benefits that we could pull out of 638 as we start working together and see the kinds of things that we could accomplish together. So not only are we yielding or creating the space for the tribes to manage these resources and take a stronger hand in it, but also that we could look at managing things differently and collaboratively. And so I'm really grateful for getting our project out there and being the one that's there on the spot at the right time and having a voice in that development. And I think with that, I'll stop and we can answer questions if there are any, unless, Libby, you have anything else you want to add.
Only that Molly Alves, who will be the project manager for the Beaver project, did say to feel free to share her contact information, which is on Tulalip Tribe's Natural Resources website, for any other tribe that might be interested in doing beaver reintroductions. Tulale's been at it for quite a while now and have been sharing a lot of what they've learned with other tribes.
Well, thank you, Libby and Dan. That was an excellent case study presentation. I am going to right now go over to Stephanie, who had picked up a question in the chat box on your presentation.
I believe this was for your presentation, but I'm sure it applies. Before you began planning this project, was there a guarantee of funds available, or did you do the planning and have that take place hoping that it would qualify for funding?
That's a really good question. It was a long, meandering process and a lot of head scratching. We tried to tie it to a vegetation management timber project that was going on in the South Fork Stille, but so that the NEPA would be done, that there would be funds coming through it. And what happened was I think Forest Service was not able to sell that timber sale. And so we were kind of back to square one in terms of where's the funding going to come. But we just just moved forward and submitted the proposal and decided we would let the Forest Service worry about that. They had said they were committed to developing this proposal. We revised our budget to make it easier to fund. We actually got rid of sort of the second piece of the original proposal to make it easier to fund, because our main concern was setting a precedent and getting a TSPA project off the ground. We had spent 2 years trying to do that, and we wanted to make sure we got to that point. We've been working with Jamie Kingsbury, who was the former forest supervisor at Mount Baker Snoqualmie. I didn't want her, she retired, I didn't want her to retire and then have to start all over again. So we were very pleased to get this off the ground and get it funded. And Dan, maybe you can address where the funding came from.
Well, so once we had the agreed or had the approval from the regional forester for the project, you know, I think someone mentioned this process of discussion starts early. Very early, and you don't want to have a TFPA proposal just suddenly show up without having a lot of collaboration. So the need for that funding was present in everyone's mind, and it's just sort of on an annual basis as you go through all the things that come up. You're trying to find that place where the money can come or we can separate it for these projects, and it's always going to be a challenge. So in the end, we did get some additional support for some dollars that came from the WO that helped us get where we needed to be for this project. But that's more of our normal process where up until now, you have projects, we all have things that we want to be working on, and then it's incumbent upon the forest to find that through either appropriated dollars or it's also possible to find it through other interested parties that can contribute to these kinds of agreements.
And I'll just add to that our proposal was for about just under $40,000. So it was not a huge proposal, costly proposal. All right. So I think with funding as an issue going forward, probably will continue to be an issue.
We did have one more question on the case study. Specifically, Dan, you made a comment about traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, superseding the Forest Service handbook with 638. There's a couple questions regarding, you know, either citations or clarifications on how that might work, or the basis of that statement.
Sure. So what I'd offer is I don't think we should be thinking that as superseding. That the what it says in the 638 is that they are not held to the manual and guidance that we have. So that's creating the opportunity for opening up opportunities for using other information. Now, that said, jointly, because it's an agreement, we can agree on what sideboards we want to put in place and what kinds of actions we want to undertake together, and the level of information or the kind of information that we want to base those management actions on. That would be a jointly determined decision. However, the space exists for making a decision that is not based on our handbook and manual. So I think that's really what I was trying to get at, is there are opportunities for innovation and opportunities for stepping away from our normal guidance to try something different under this authority here.
Thanks, Dan. I think we have one more closeout from Lynn.
Dan, and Libby, I have one more question for you. If you could turn back the hands of time, knowing what you know now, is there anything you'd do differently?
You know, I'm not quite sure what we could have done differently. We collaborated very closely with the Forest Service staff from the Mount Baker Snow Quality from the get-go, you know, starting with the workshop where there was a stated interest in developing a pilot for the Mount Baker Snow Quality. I think, you know, what made it probably take so much time is that nobody really understood sort of administratively the steps for developing a TFPA on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. I know it's, you know, been more common in other, you know, for other tribes and other forests, and maybe more straightforward in terms of some of the projects. So I don't think there's too much we could have done differently. There was a learning curve for everybody, and we just pursued. As we always say, it's kind of a matter of how much you put into it. You'll finally get the outcomes you need, depending on how much staff you're willing to contribute to it. And we decided that this was one we wanted to see bring it to a successful closure. So.
Yeah, I'd agree. It'd be great if we had that money secured in advance. That certainly would have made things move a little bit faster. But the learning curve on figuring out how to do these things is sometimes it just takes somebody who has the time to figure it out to get us there.
And I think if Dan had been on the forest prior, we may have gotten there faster. I think they needed somebody who sort of was very interested and keyed into some of the partnership work here.
This has been just great. Thank you so much to both Dan and Libby and your whole team that have brought this forward. One of the reasons that this was brought into this engagement was this idea of kind of sharing a postcard of what's coming up and along the way with 638. And as they noted, this is a learning process that's been set up, and so it's an intentional pilot into a continuous learning process. So I think Lynn has touched on that and probably will again. Those questions that we have in the chat box on this are also being collected still, and we will sweep those up as we can within the time that we have left today. And again, Lynn's going to let you know what's going to be happening next and how those questions are going to be managed. So what I'm going to do now is move us to the next section in our agenda on sharing information. And so let me move our slide over here. What we're going to do now in this session is transition to some polling questions, and Ashley Warner is going to come in and just give us a little bit of background on that and some directions. She'll give us those, the post-webinar activities will include some additional polling or some additional questions to participants along with that webinar post package. And we're going to go ahead then and turn it over to Ashley to get us set up and to Tisha to start pulling up those questions for us.
Sure. We've got, I think if we could just, I don't know if you guys can see all of these, so maybe we can close a couple of these. Well, I mean, you guys can also scroll. If you're able to expand that and see the questions and you're able to vote, that's fine. But these polling questions are based on feedback that came out of our 638 fan table exercise a couple of weeks ago. So we had a smaller group of Forest Service folks and tribal representatives that helped us kind of walk through and start to develop this template and kind of walk through what it would be like to, you know, set up one of these projects from scratch. And so, but, you know, an exercise that we did at first was just discussing what we wanted this relationship to look like, you know, a unique 638 program in the Forest Service. And I know that we're focused on project level implementation right now.
but just thinking about like long-term, what we want these agreements to look like, how we want them to shape the government-to-government relationship between tribes and the agency, and how we want to seek mutual benefits. So, they came up with several themes that jumped out as a result of that conversation, but we just wanted to get a sense from you all as a larger group of stakeholders that may one day be implementing some of these projects and gauge what's the most important thing. So these 9 priorities, 638 agreements should be, of all of these different things that we would love for them, all these different boxes that we would love for them to check, what are the most important things that we need to be looking out for? Similarly, what should we avoid at all costs? And finally, and I don't know if I see any responses yet for this 4th one in the lower right corner, but maybe this is one that we can revisit closer towards the end of the webinar today. But what other tools or resources do you need? What we want to have walking away from this, and I think Lynn touched on this at the very start, was there's going to be several resources that are produced as a result of the sand table and of these 2 webinars that we're holding, the best practices guide and some templates, but we want to know what other sorts of resources do you need, either as a Forest Service person working on the forest or a tribal representative. What kind of resources do you need to be able to start thinking about what kind of projects you could do where you work, and to start those conversations. So Chaz, I don't know, I'll defer to our facilitator here. Maybe we hold that question until the end, or do you want people to respond to it now?
No, go ahead. I just put a message in the chat box to go ahead and start answering that now. Since we did gain a little bit of time, we have some more time. And so what I'd like to do is lean to both Cody and Lynn to tell me, and Jim, to tell me what you're seeing here. Anything popping up from you, or anything that you're thinking back to from when we did the sand table activity. So I'll go to Cody first, and then you could pass it over to Lynn or Jim if you have any thoughts of things that are popping up from the answers you see here in the polling. What's important, et cetera.
So this is Cody. What I'm seeing is pretty consistent with what we heard in the sand table, and pretty consistent with what we heard during the TFPA workshops we had a few years ago. So like flexibility is something that I think is important to a lot of tribes. Many of them have a diversity of management objectives they're trying to accomplish for a number of different things that are priorities to them. And then increased capacity to do work. So that's been a challenge that we've recognized for years with trying to implement the TFPA authorities, is that tribes are really only funded to do work on trust acres, and they don't have many other revenue streams to support that type of work. So funding, increased capacity, staffing are all important things to be able to participate actively in that off-reservation management. And again, improved health of shared landscapes, I mean, that's a priority not only of tribes, but of the forests and just people in general of the region. So again, looks very consistent with what we heard in the sand table and the TFPA workshops from a few years ago. Jim, I'm not sure if you want to go next. Maybe still on mute, Jim?
Might be on mute on your phone as well, Jim. Or do you want to maybe pick that up, and Jim, you can just bring your voice into the room when you're ready?
There we go.
This is Lynn.
I hear Jim. Go ahead, Jim.
Man, this technology is rough. The only thing that I would like to add to that conversation is this whole idea about the shared decision-making and shared management of the land. I think that that's really one of the ultimate goals, or the bottom line goals of cross-boundary collaboration, where the tribes have a say in defining priorities or land management priorities across landscapes, in which they have, like we mentioned before, that deep cultural tie remaining on that landscape. So, to me, I'm glad that that one ranks pretty high, and it's really one of the ultimate goals. Irregardless of which tool or which contracting mechanism is used or which authority, I'd said long before that if tribes had a seat at the table early in that process or early in the planning process, this all would be easy. So that's just what I'd like to add. Thanks.
Great. And I've asked them to take a little bit of a look. What I'd like to do right now, since we have a bit of time, I'd like to take the opportunity. We've got about 200 people in the room today, and so we intentionally use the chat box in order to establish a means of getting everyone's voices in the room. Since we're doing well on time, what I'd like to do is around the concept of shared decision-making and shared management of the land. I'd like to take bring a couple of other voices in the room. So the first three folks I see with a hand raised, I'd like to, if someone would like to elaborate on that a little bit, we'll have you bring your voice into the room with a *6 to unmute. And you just need to use the, up at the top right of the top bar of your Adobe Connect, you'll see the person with their hand raised. Just grab that bar and grab the hand raise there if you'd like to speak to something on shared decision-making and shared management of the land, that topic. I'm not seeing any hands raised yet, so what I'm going to do is while I check and see if any do come into the room, I'm going to ask Lynn or someone from the Forest Service side as well as from Jim and Cody's perspective. Anything you'd like to add on that? In addition, I know Dan spoke to it a little bit, but it's the people part with all of the collaboration that is the part that has the greatest return and can offer some of the deepest investment to move forward. So anything on that, Lynn, or any of the other Forest Service staff from the conveners today in the room?
So this is Lynn. I'll take a quick stab at it, and it kind of goes back to one of the questions that I see in the chat box about saying my forest doesn't have enough funding to do all of my priority work. So that's why it's so critical that we have our tribal partners at the table when we're doing out-year planning, when we're doing forest planning, when we're looking at setting priorities under shared stewardship. It can't just be purely opportunistic to work in partnership. It has to be intentional, just like Dan and Libby have talked about.
With that, Lynn, I'd like to move over to Bill Tripp and invite him to *6 to unmute. I'll then go to Greg Kaufman and Lisa I apologize if I say this wrong, Radosevic Craig. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, so on the topic of shared decision making and shared co-management, shared stewardship, whatever we're calling it these days, one of the biggest things, the issues that we're having here in Kuduk country is that we've done very well collaborating on initiating NEPA project development, as well as getting some cross-boundary NEPA completed. We haven't been that great at being able to actually burn across those lines. And so there are some fundamental issues that I believe the 638 process can help us overcome, in that the 638 authority gives you a cleaner line to tort coverage for your burn bosses. And so the liability issue has been problematic, as well as the agency staffing for response resources when the prescribed burn windows are presenting themselves, that have been precluding us from being able to get the burning done. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are in regards to being able to get a 638 agreement in place to fund leadership and support roles for prescribed burning at the landscape scale as part of a larger landscape level approach to protecting the Indian forest lands.
I'd like to pick that up from the team.
This is Lynn, and I agree with you completely, Bill. I think we've got to be planning and talking together in order to make this all work. So thank you for putting that out in the room.
Thanks. How about Greg? Greg, do you want to star 6 to unmute yourself and bring your thoughts into the room to share?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Great. I think this was asked in the chat room, but I'm not sure there was an answer given, and that is, does each region or each district have a list of TFPA projects ready to go that have been spec'd out and NEPA approved, or would a tribe approach the region or the correct subdivision of the Forest Service and then kind of pitch a project to them?
Anyone like to pick that, any responses to that up from the convening team?
This is Cody.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, this is Alicia. Can you hear me?
We can. We'll go Alicia, Cody, Lynn.
Yeah, I think that that would ultimately be dependent upon any particular forest. Typically what I have seen done, and I'll leave Cody and Jim to fill this in more thoroughly, is that a tribe who has an interest, sees a need on a forest or a risk on a forest, would approach that forest to initiate the negotiation of an agreement. I think it would be awesome if everyone had an inventory of work that we could implement, but from what I've seen to date, it's been one at a time, those individual relationships negotiating a project.
Okay, thank you. And then just a second question. Can this program be used to implement riparian restoration projects? You know, I guess the more specific question is, does the TFPA allow for riparian restoration projects, or is it just forestry? And thank you very much.
Cody, you want to take that, maybe circle back to your answers on the first question there as well as Jim?
Sure. So first, with the TFPA proposals, the forest has 120 days to respond to those. So there's not a number of proposals sitting out there on the shelf waiting for funding or the availability of staff to implement. It's kind of as needed basis. Typically the tribe reaches out, has some communication with the forest, and then submits a proposal if it looks like it's something that's conducive to both the forest and the tribe. But as far as what the limitations on the project work are, there really are none. So when we look at natural resource projects at Colville, it's very similar to what they implement on the Colville National Forest on our north border. So when we evaluate the project, we're looking at forest health, we're looking at fuels and fire resilience, we're looking at aquatic health, road management, any number of different things are potential possibilities. And that's, again, using 638 to do the project planning in NEPA, and then maybe potentially other mechanisms for the implementation, like stewardship contracting, where you're retaining some of that revenue generated from the project or proceeds to do some of that other service type work, whether that's replacing culverts or improving trails or aquatic management.
Okay, thank you very much for those answers.
Was there anything else that, did Jim want to add anything there, or should we move over to Lisa's question?
No, I could add. In my experience with TFPA, it actually worked from the Forest Service asking the tribe if they were interested in a TFPA type project. The Forest Service already had a project, a 1,000-acre commercial thin that included some prescribed fire, some pile burning, some road construction, some road maintenance type work there, and it involved both a pre-commercial and a small wood or small log component. And they had it NEPA ready and actually approached the tribe to gauge interest and to see if the tribe wanted to do that project under TFPA. And I've also seen, tribes propose projects that could actually expand on the work or the restoration or field reduction work that the tribe has done on their side of the border. So it can work both ways, from my experience.
Thanks for that, Jim. And then let's go over to Lisa's question.
Hi, this is Lisa. And basically I wanted to speak in support of the shared stewardship from the Chippewa National Forest, and we coexist along with the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. 90% of their reservation is within the forest boundaries, and about 45% of the forest is within the reservation boundaries. And we have 5 TFPA projects with the band at this point, including one of prescribed fire to increase the amount of prescribed fire. And I think the biggest concern is the additional funding to help get some of these projects moving. So we're looking forward to moving into a 638 agreement, but especially for the pilot projects and to get this going off. If the regions or the Washington office could free up some additional funds, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
I'd like to pick that one up. Or is there another member of the working group that you'd like to pass any of these to or bring their voices into the room? Lynn, Cody, Jim, Stephanie.
This is Lynn. Just a real quick comment that funding continues to be an issue, and that's what happens when we get, and I hate to use unfunded authority, but it's just what happened with Good Neighbor, and we found a way to make it work. We made it a priority to make it work. Let's see, Gary Church is on, who's the lead for this. And Gary, if you want to *6 to open up your phone line and address that, that'd be terrific.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey,
you're good.
Yeah. So the funding, Lynn started addressing it, and she's exactly right and spot on. Right now, with National Forest Systems budget, which also includes the hazardous fuels reduction piece as well, the majority of the money is really already going out to the fields. The Washington office is operating on shoestring budgets. What we are trying to do, though, is at the end of the year, if additional monies come in or if something else comes up that doesn't get funded or there's some extra dollars, we are trying to get those, just like we did with the Beaver project that Dan talked about earlier. That money was kind of some end of the year money that didn't get obligated, and we were able to shift over. So I know the Washington office, this is a big priority, and we want to fund it as much as possible, but I would advise Forest not to count on funding coming with this. It needs to be planned early in the forest plans, and probably it's going to have to be budgeted with allocated dollars from the forests, or there are some other ways to fund things like Lynn talked earlier, but I know that's not what people want to hear, but that's kind of where we're at right now with the budget. We're trying to send as much out to the field early just to address all the active management. And I guess I would also just say this, it's a way of getting work done on the ground and being a good partner, and when people see the agency working with their partners in shared stewardship, it's just a plus for everybody. And, that could potentially lead to some larger budgets from Congress, but right now our hands are pretty tied with the funding that we've got. But, I will commit to trying to get into your money to push out and support as many of these as we can.
Lynn, did we answer? Go ahead, Alicia. Did you have something to add?
Sorry, I was just going to add on to Gary's comments and Lynn's comments. As we all know, funding is a chronic issue. As Gary mentioned, on the WO side, we have a lot of those conversations about it. Gary touched on something that was really key, too, and that's the forest planning phase. And that's where, as work gets planned out, that's the optimal opportunity there at the beginning to look at what your scope of work or your out-year planning is going to be. And as we look to partners and tribes to do that kind of work, that's the optimal, is be there when the funds are actually getting obligated versus today, because this is a new authority and we're figuring out our path. But I will be one to say that's really the optimal opportunity, is to bake this work into those forest plans and the scope of work, or the planned work.
And this is Cody. If I could just add a bit more, that's why it's important to have those conversations with your forest early in the process to understand what their funding situation is. Because if they've got available funding, you can scope a project such that they can pay for it, or you can look at other available funding sources like reserve treaty rights landscape funding, or potentially tribal dollars, or other partners that can help fund these projects. And maybe it's not a huge project the first time, but as you understand how each other's organizations work, how this agreement works, that you can find other opportunities for funding in the future.
Any others to add to that before we move from the group? Okay, great. I don't have any questions in the hands raised in the chat box right now. What I'm going to do is ask Lynn or Cody, some of the folks that are on the line here, to talk about what we got, the 37 answers we got so far, and the tools or resources requested, and how that relates to what's planned.
Well, this is Lynn. I'll go first, since we can't Rochambeau for who is it. I'm seeing a lot of things like frequently asked questions and guidance, and let's add this to the decision tree, and best practices, and that's exactly the direction that we're heading. You know, this is just our start, really, to try and learn and understand what we don't even know is out there yet. And so we'll be building this best practices guide, and we'll be changing it and updating it, and it will not be done in a vacuum. This isn't going to just be a Forest Service internal exercise. This will involve our tribal partners, and there will be lots of opportunity for collaboration on that. So I'll turn it over to Jim or Cody.
This is Cody. I would just add that, again, this is a pilot project, so we want to ensure that we're successful so that this authorization becomes permanent. Because, again, I think it's another one of the tools that we can use that can be extremely beneficial, with the Good Neighbor Authority that was granted also in the 2018 Farm Bill, and all of the other authorities that the Forest Service has to get work done with collaborators. So again, the comments I'm seeing, the things that people are prioritizing are very consistent with what we've heard before. I think it's pretty consistent with what we see as priorities for these new authorities and how we get work done across the landscape collaboratively. So I'm very encouraged by what I'm seeing.
Chaz, we had a question regarding a number of different requests about how other program funds might be able to be utilized as 638 authority, or whether that's what makes the 638 authority a better mechanism. So that might get to why it's a good tool, if anybody wanted to address that.
I know we have Gary on the line and Lynn. Lynn, how would you like to handle that question?
Well, I'll take this one, and then but I would like Gary to talk about, we've had some questions about CFLRP funding and whether that would work. So Gary, maybe you can think about that for a moment. Other funding that we have, and why we would use 638 over another type of agreement. One of the things we have is that there's no match required, and so that helps a lot, so as opposed to using one of our challenge cost share or participating agreements. And it really, to me, 638 is even more about, it's a different kind of relationship. And that's the thing that we really need to keep in mind with 638 as opposed to our other agreement types. Again, and this question's come through a couple of times, right now for addressing, for implementing 638 and through the pilot, we're looking at projects. But we understand that 638 authority is written for programs so that we could have a tribal cooperator perform one of our programs, like the Heritage Program, or like Bill Tripp mentioned, the Hazardous Fuel Reduction Program for us. And so it's bigger than just projects like we're used to working on with our other agreements. So to me, those are the big differences, and I don't know if anybody else would like to chime in on that.
This is Alicia. I would like to follow up on that, Lynn. Too. You're exactly right. We have a lot of tools. 638 authority is different. It's not just sole source contracting or not just another mechanism. It has a very explicit intent. And I'll harken back to one of Jim's earlier comments about this decision space, which is actually mirrors the shared stewardship conversation as well, is providing tribes that voice in the decision making on lands that where they hold trust assets or that are traditional homelands. So it does have a different, it speaks to, as you mentioned, Lynn, that relationship. It's different than the other work that we've done to date. And so I think that is one thing to be mindful of moving forward with this conversation and with implementing this new authority.
So we're going to have Gary jump in there with a little bit on the funding. Star 6 to unmute, Gary. Or your phone mute as well. Let's go ahead and keep moving in case.
What about now?
There you are, Gary. Gotcha.
Hey.
So I can't answer the CFLR question. I think so, but I just texted our CFLRP coordinator, Jessica Robertson, and as soon as I texted her link went yellow. So if she answers before this call's over, I'll get that question answered. I would hate to give out bad information right now.
Thanks, Gary. Any more hands in the room before I move us over? Tisha, you want to go ahead and pull up the slide 34 for me, please?
Chaz, while that's happening, I do want to make a point that the questions that, like this one about using the CFLRP funding, if we can't answer them today, those will be included in the FAQs.
Thanks, Lynn. I'm going to have Lynn copy for us, go over what's next, and then we'll go back to you can introduce Katie for the closing today, Lynn. Does that work?
That
and
works
Cody.
just great.
Super.
That works just great. So first thing I want to do is thank everybody for being here, for participating, for all of the great questions, and my gosh, what a super group of speakers we've had today too. So the question always comes up of what's next, and as Chaz refers to this is what's your gift bag, right? What are we going to give everybody at the end of the session? Keep in mind that we have another session. We'll be doing this same presentation again next week on August 4th. What you'll receive via email after that August 4th session, and you'll need to give us just a little time to breathe, you'll have an opportunity, a forum for asking additional questions. We will have a link to the best practices guide that will be on the Forest Service external website and then also linked at ITC's website. You'll also get a link to the recorded webinars. We'll post those, and then as well as all of the documents that we've got set here as the downloadable files. So we will be sending out additional information. So this is not, and keep in mind, this is not just a one and done. We know that there's a need for more and more information as we move forward, and we will do our very best to provide that. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Katie O'Connor, who is the Acting Associate Deputy Chief in State and Private Forestry, to give us a closeout from the Forest Service, and then we'll have Cody close out the webinar for us after Katie.
Thanks, Lynn. Katie, do we have you live? *6 to unmute.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. I think I'm unmuted.
You're good.
Great, thanks. So I just want to say that I really, really have enjoyed listening and learning with everyone here today. And just want to sincerely thank everyone for their engagement. It was really inspiring to hear about this year of adaptive learning that we've undergone with our tribal partners, and the Forest Service has really been able to take time to truly listen, and I hope that it has felt that way, and to integrate tribal perspectives into our thinking and actions from the very outset with this authority. From the kickoff meeting in last April to the webinar today, the Intertribal Steering Council and Steering Committee with the Forest Service have met monthly, charting the course, and continuing to plan into next year, as we heard about today. So at every step along the way, I heard in all of the reflections and speakers today that this partnership has listened and learned from each other and really worked hard to create a collaborative process to serve as a model for other efforts. We heard about the sand table exercise earlier this summer, and one of the pilot projects that has been used to craft the templates that we also saw and talked about today. So the information, the best practices that have come from this work, we collected. A lot of the information sharing here today can inform our Tribal Forest Protection Act proposals and assessments of what changes to Forest Service policy might be necessary to promote success from now into the future. So if the Forest Service does pursue official policy changes to reflect this new authority, then of course we will initiate the government-to-government consultation process. And in the meantime, because finalizing things like that can take time, we do sincerely hope and recommend that tribes and their local Forest Service partners will act together upon expressions of interest for qualifying TFPA projects using 638, because as we've heard at this early stage, we have some regulatory flexibility under the demonstration authority. And we do hope for those early conversations that folks will closely coordinate with our Washington Office Forest Management staff, who we've been hearing from today, so that we can benefit from and be part of the learning throughout the process. I really look forward to a future engagement and imagine that we would hear about a lot of new opportunities that will come from some strategic out-year planning between the Forest Service and tribal partners. And of course, the desired outcome would be that engaging in early planning to identify some mutual priorities and funding options can lead to 638 projects starting to show up as part of our forest and tribe strategy to accomplish critical work together on the ground and in important places and landscapes that you identify together. So just thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thanks to our tribal partners who have worked closely with us throughout the process. We're learning together. We're going to keep learning together, and I really appreciate what we're striving for together. So I'll stop there and hand it back. Thanks, everyone, for spending time with us today.
Go ahead, Cody.
All right, I just wanted to thank everybody today. Great engagement, great questions. I think this really creates a platform for a shared understanding of what this means between both tribes and the Forest Service. So my hope is that from this webinar or the webinar that we have last week, folks have enough confidence in what this could potentially be going forward to make those contacts, whether it's forest to tribe or tribe to forest, and see where there's potential. Again, we are limited to 10, but ITC recognizes that there's differences in the way things are done and what the resource priorities are across the country. So it would be ideal to have a diversity of projects that captures all of that diversity, so that once we develop a final process, whatever a final 638 contract mechanism looks like, it's something that works across the country for all tribes and all forests. And that's all I have.
Well, thanks, Cody. And I just want to thank everyone for your time today. We had committed to time. If there's anybody that would like to ask a final question, we'll stay in the room for 5 minutes here, a few minutes. But other than that, we're all set for today, and we thank you for joining us, and we look forward to sharing information with you along the way.
Thanks very much, everybody.